Well, hello there ladies, gentlemen and all variations thereupon. It's time to get back into sewing. It's been a while, but this time round we're making the winter dress. Although it's a Christmas gift for my niece, it's been a very long time in the making. It started when I watched this video, link up there, and in that basically she's going through the different types of wool, the different ways that you care for it, how you use it, how it's used in historical fashion. And while I was watching it, I come up with the idea of making my niece a dress for Christmas, a winter dress. The winter dress. But I didn't have much of an idea beyond just a dress, winter, blue. Because my niece was only 3 months old at the time, or not quite 3 months yet, there was no way I was going to make it then because she would have grown so much it would be impossible to judge how big she's going to be in another 3 months' time. So what I did is I just ordered the materials, because at that age you order 1 metre of any material, no matter what the width is, you're going to be able to get some child clothing out of it because of just how small they are and how much material you normally get. So I ordered 2 different types of wool, one light blue, one dark blue, some silk as lining material, and white cotton, for reasons I shall explain later. And although I had this material, I couldn't start making it because obviously she's going to grow. And that gave me a lot of time to plan, which was both a blessing and a curse, because whilst I got a lot of time to plan it out, it did mean that my ideas started getting more and more elaborate and wild. And I'm not actually that experienced a sewer, so I can't let my imagination run that wild, because otherwise I'm going to run right past my abilities and just end up messing everything up. But come the start of December, I've got 3 weeks basically to make a dress, so I can start the sewing process. All I have to do is measure her, which I did do, wrote down some quick measurements, and then spent the rest of the 3 weeks worrying that I've not done the measurements right and it's not going to fit her by the time she gets it. But you know, such is life. First step in creating this dress was actually to do some embroidery, because one of the things that I decided I wanted to do on there was to have 2 sets of embroidery. I wanted snowflakes around the skirt, but I can do that at any point, but I also wanted some red winter berries on what would be the cloak. But these winter berries are going to be down by the hem, and if they're down by the hem, it's going to be very difficult to embroider, because when embroidering, the easiest thing to do is to put it in an embroidery hoop. But if you're going to put something in an embroidery hoop, ideally you want to be embroidering in the centre of the hoop, not near the edge, because then you're going to get into problems of trying to pass the needle through at an angle so it's going to hit the wood. It's just a lot easier to do in the centre. But if you're embroidering right down the edge by the hem, then you're going to run into some problems of, you know, trying to fit it all in. So it's easier to embroider before you've cut anything out or anything. Just measure out exactly where you want it, or roughly where you want it, embroider it on, and then cut the rest of the shape to fit around that. And that's my top tip for today, although there's going to be a lot of tips. And with that bit of embroidery done, which is very Christmassy, especially in England, you can't go down any street without seeing some bush with red winter berries on it, it seems. Now we can get on to actually making the dress. And the first protocol I had was to do the skirt, trying to offset it as close as I could to the one end of the material so that I can maximise the amount of space I've got left over in case I need to recut an extra part of the dress, of the bodice. So I've done basically just a simple circle skirt, folded it up several times, drew on a curve, and cut out to that curve. Now what I didn't do was cut the waist to the exact measurement that I had made of my niece's waist, because the waist size on a baby can change quite a lot, because first they lose baby weight, then they gain baby weight, and then as they start growing upwards the weight can be lost. So the waistline can change dramatically on someone so young. So rather than cut out the full size, what I did was cut 4 different snips around the outside of the circle so that I could then fold it over and create the waistline that I needed to when the time came for it. So at this point I should point out one of the crazy ideas I had whilst planning this build. Because she's going to grow so quickly, being so young, I don't want her to just grow out of this after a couple of months so she gets to wear it this one winter and then next winter she's never going to be able to wear it. So in order to get around that problem, I've designed it so that all of the seams can be let out and increase the size dramatically. So she should be able to wear it again next year at the very least, hopefully. One way I decided to account for that growth that she's going to have, and one way to extend the life of the dress, is to use those snips that I've made to fold down to the waistline that I want. And if it ends up being too big and I need to shrink the waistline again, I can undo that seam, cut off the stitches, and then roll it out a little bit, sew it back together, and where the snips are, put a few stitches across there to hold it together and keep it sealed. But when she grows and it needs to be extended, made longer, just roll down a little bit more, and then the hem, which is also going to have quite a lot of material folded up, undo the stitching on that hem and roll that down so I can maintain the same length of the skirt, so it can grow at either side and shrink at either side, thus hopefully extending the life of the dress. When it comes to the bodice then, the only place we really need to worry about the extra stitching is going to be at the side seam. As long as there's enough material left on the side seam, then we can undo the stitching, open it out a little bit, sew it back up and fit it to whatever diameter is necessary at the top of the skirt. So hopefully with those few measures I'll be able to extend the life of the skirt for a long time. The other seams around the bodice we don't really need to worry about. But after we've created the circle skirt and cut everything out, then it comes to doing some of the embroidery, because as I've just mentioned, having a skirt that can be extended and contracted at the tops and bottoms, we want to make sure that the embroidery stays around the centre. So I did a bunch of little snowflake designs as best I could around the centre of the skirt, trying to do as much variety as possible, because you know the old saying that no two snowflakes are ever alike. So I used up all my white embroidery thread and trying to create as many different snowflakes as I could around the outside. When it comes to the bodice, for this, I decided to go for more of a pinafore kind of dress, because without having the sleeves on there, it becomes a lot easier to create a dress that can be expanded and contracted as she grows. Sleeves are very difficult, they are a devil's work, so if I can get away with not having to constantly let out and take in the seams and ease them in and all that lot, then I'm going to take it. So it's a pinafore style dress. We've got the bodice is simply going to be two sections, almost identical front and back. The only real difference is that the back piece is going to have two straps that extend around to the front so that I can clip it on. I didn't manage to put in as much seam allowance as I'd hoped for. I underestimated it, but hopefully it'll work out at least for this year, and worst case scenario is that I'll make another bodice next year. Once everything's cut out, the first really little fiddly bit we need to do is the hem all around the outside of the bodice. So we need to make sure that the raw edges aren't showing, but because it's baby clothes, the seams are very small and difficult, so it's easier just to roll them up and then try and pin them in place and then sew along there. Ideally what you do is do a felling stitch where you sew through the fold or the roll that you've made for the hem, take up just one or two threads of the rest of the material and then pull tight so that you don't see any of the stitching on the outside. Unfortunately, because I only had 3 weeks to do it and I work a full-time job and I'm trying to do other things at the same time, she's not the only person I need to get presents for, I've decided just to do it as on a machine. I didn't manage to get it perfectly straight because I'm not that great at making a straight line while sewing, especially not a curved line. Some of it I had to go back in by hand afterwards and make sure everything's secured and roughly straight. It looks good enough for what I need, so the sides are just going to be sewn together with a straight stitch. No fancy stitching. All I'm going to do is press the seams down and then sew the seams directly to the sides. I haven't actually done it yet because I'm trying to get this video out, but I'm probably going to do just the felling stitch down the sides. It'll take a little bit longer, but you won't see the extra stitch, and all the seams will be out of the way. And as I've said, because the skirt needs to be extended and contracted along the hem and the waistline, we're going to use a lot of extra material in that. So it's going to be folded over twice with a very thick hem, and that can cause a bit of a problem with the changing of the diameter. You can end up with little bits that are tucked and puckered and things around the side, so it's very difficult. You've got to try and basically do easing around the outside of the hem to try and make sure all of the excess material is distributed evenly, otherwise you get end up with bits that try and roll up and flick up. I did get that a little bit, but ran the iron across it and I managed to get it to stay down. Something to keep in mind if you're doing this kind of thing, and this doesn't just apply for baby clothes as well. If you want to make your own skirt and you're a sort of person that puts a lot of weight on around the waist and you want to account for the fact that your waistline may grow, putting the extra material around the waist and the hem in the same way, using the snips around the waistline, then you can create a skirt that can be lengthened and shrunk and expanded and contracted around the waist, just to extend the life of your clothes. Because you know we don't want to create any excess waste if we can avoid it. Now, one thing I will say is if you're trying to buy thread on Amazon, then you will see these types of thread come up very often. These threads are very cheap, but they're very bad. But the thing is, they don't sit properly on a standard sewing machine, they sort of wobble and bobble across. So when you're trying to sew with them, it's creating extra friction along that thread, which pulls extra tension, which causes a lot more jamming and a lot more problems with birds nesting and things like that. But what can happen is you'll end up snapping a lot of needles. I snapped 2 needles trying to use this thread. After I snapped the second needle and I need to buy more, I made sure I brought myself some proper thread, some Gutermann's one, because you know, I just needed something that's actually going to work in the machine and I'm not going to have to worry about my needles snapping because of the extra tension. But getting back to the build. Now once you've got everything sewed up, you're going to want to find a way to attach the straps to the front. I did that with press studs, but to make sure I've got them in the right place, first what I've done is I've hung it up, I've put some safety pins in, and I even went so far as to use a spirit level in order to make sure everything was lined up, so the 2 sides of the dress are going to sit level when it's hung up with where I've safety pinned on the strap. After that I use an awl to poke a hole through the material. Now I'm not actually poking a hole in the material. What I'm doing is I'm pushing the awl in between the threads, and it moves the threads apart. And what that does is it creates a space for the parts of the press stud to be placed in. You can get away with just using a pen or something like that. You just got to be more forceful because pens aren't as sharp as awls, so you need a bit more wiggling and finagling. But I've got an awl, so I use an awl. And the press stud itself is really easy to put together. You just place the parts on the anvil, use the little metal prong bit that's provided, and give it a good old whack with the hammer. Bend the things into place, and the press stud will press in and clip on. Now because I wanted to be able to change the size of this dress, put a second set of press studs further down. The reason for this is if she needs it smaller, clip it onto the lower set of studs. If she wants it bigger, clip it onto the higher set of studs. So there we have it, that's the dress done. But the part that I embroidered the red winter berries on hasn't been used. So what's that going to be for, Bridge? Well, I had too much time to contemplate exactly what I'm going to build, didn't I? So I went to an elaborate length and I decided that this build needs a cloak. So I drafted myself a cloak made of 3 panels, 2 triangular ones that have the red winter berries at the bottom, and a just big rectangle that's going to be the back piece. And then having cut out those panels, pin them together so I get a sort of idea of the shape of it, and then use the top edge of that cloak, of the 3 panels that make the cloak, in order to decide the sort of shape that the hood should have. So I did sort of a long pointy hood with like an elf shape to it because I think that's cute. I might even sew a bell on the end, I don't know yet. Now when you've sewn these pieces together, you can sew the 3 panels, press them, fell the stitches, and just have them on the inside. Once you've got the cloak on, no one's going to see. It's not going to be that visible. Now some people are allergic to wool, and as I actually don't know if my niece is allergic to wool yet, I decided to do a lining material. And the dress itself isn't going to be in contact with her skin all that much because she's going to have something on underneath it, but the cloak, when you put the hood up, it's going to start pressing against the cheeks. So what I decided to do was put a lining material on, and I've got myself some silk to do that. Now the silk itself is not the highest quality silk, it's very sheer and very see-through, and it's not going to do a great job of hiding the seams, but it is silk and it is soft and it is very nice. So I'm going to cut out an exact same pattern that I did for the panels that make up the outside of the cloak, another 3 panels and the inside of the hood, in order to create a lining for the hood itself. Once all that's cut out, the silk is very difficult to work with, and I'm so glad I bought the better threads to work with, because trying to use the crappy thread on the silk would have just been a nightmare. Now in the cloak that I made before, the big one for me, I left a space around the inside of the hood in order to be able to turn it inside out, which is what you need to do. When you've sewn everything together, you pull the whole thing inside out, and then you sew up the gap that you've pulled through with an invisible seam. On this cloak, however, I left the seam at the back of the hood open because the silk is so hard to work with. Trying to sew along the inside of that seam after I've turned it was just going to be a nightmare, so I left the seam on the outside, so it's the wool that needs to be sewn up afterwards. And in order to close up that gap after we turned it, it's just sew an invisible stitch, and we do this by placing the needle into the material, having it travel along the inside of the material a little ways, coming out again, passing directly over to the other bit of material, passing to the inside, travelling along a bit, and then coming out. And then when you put it tight, where you've gone from one side of the material, so the hood side, to the actual cloak side, and you put it tight, those two pieces would press together and you don't see the stitch in the middle. Because you were travelling along the inside to move along to the next stitch, you don't see that either, so you end up not seeing any stitching along that line. So there we have it. We've got the dress, we've got a cloak to go on the outside. Now I'm not going to do a clasp on this cloak because I don't want anything pressed around the neck of a child, anything that could be pulled taut and choke them. So the way it's going to be attached is with another 2 press studs that are going to be passed through the actual cloak material onto the dress, but I've not done that and recorded it because I'm recording this before Christmas, before she's had it, and I wanted to have her wear it so I can measure up and make sure I've put the cloak in the right place. Now my niece does something that my sister-in-law calls a punani, and this can be summed up with the fart noise followed by my sister-in-law looking down and going, "Oh, it's all up her back," because that's what happens, and it always happens with small children, especially before they're on solid foods, which she is only just getting onto. Whilst wool, it can be very easy to clean. We don't want to have poo sitting on it for ages so that it dries and then brush it off. That's not going to work, and we can't just stick it in the washer dryer because heat and friction on a wool tends not to work. That's how you start to make felt, so it's not really an option for busy young parents, is it? So what we're going to do is create something that's going to be easily washable, that can be a barrier between the nappy and the dress, some sort of like punami break. And so to build this, I've done what I've done before for myself as well, as you'll see in this video, that I made a medieval dress of the future, which is basically just taking an old medieval underwear pattern. I've gone through it before because it's in that video, I'm not going to go into great detail. It's a really simple build to make. It's very efficient in the amount of material it uses, and it's a really simple project to sew together. Basically, the whole thing's built up just out of rectangles. Some of the rectangles you cut in half via a diagonal line to create triangles, but basically you have 2 smaller rectangles that have been cut into triangles that sit at the side of a longer rectangle that's twice the length of the dress. Fold it in half, cut the head hole, put some more rectangles for the sleeves, some triangles underneath, and you're done. The only difference between what I'm doing this time round and what I did before is on the sleeves. See, before, what you'd do is you have a rectangle for the sleeve and then 2 smaller rectangles that get cut into triangles to go underneath in order to create the extra expansive material so that you've got some range of motion and movement. I'm not going to do that for a baby's clothes because those triangles would be incredibly small and incredibly difficult to sew. So what I'm doing instead is I'm cutting a larger triangle and I'm just snipping off the extra material around the edge. And we do that so we create a narrower opening at the front for the wrist and have it wider at the top for the arm. So you've got the range of motion there without like letting in a draft up the other end. So one thing to keep in mind is you don't go too tight around the wrist. Now for us, it's not too much of a problem if the end of the sleeve is fairly narrow, because we can just close up our fingers to make our hands narrower and put our hands through. However, for a baby, anyone who's ever tried to put clothes on a baby will know when you try and put their arm through a sleeve, they have a tendency to do this. And as I don't want to break any thumbs, what we're going to do is leave a fairly large opening around the wrist, but we are going to taper in to stop any kind of draft coming in. The material I'm using for this obviously is just a simple white cotton. The only thing to keep in mind is when you're doing the triangle seams at the side, you want to pay attention to your bias lines, where you've got straight lines where it's all the threads are going at right angles, like directly down vertically. We'll want to make sure that is sewn to something that's been cut on the bias, so the threads are all short, they go up and then the diagonal cuts them off. So we end up with the slope side next to the straight side. And once you've sewn all that up and you've sewn the sleeves on, then it's just a case of hemming, felling the seams, pressing the seams, things you don't really need to see me do because you've already seen me do it several times before, and I've already made a video of making this exact dress just bigger. And there we have it, that's the winter dress. I'm not going to show you it being modelled because A, I haven't given it to her yet because I'm filming this before Christmas, and B, I'm not going to parade my niece in front of you for your entertainment, you animals. But if you've enjoyed this video, why not check out some of the other videos, like the video where I make my size version of this dress, or the video where I make the cloak, so you can see how you do those bits in more detail. If you enjoyed what you see and you like my work, then why not click over here and subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be doing some more sewing videos soon, doing some historic ones, and Might do some electronics builds actually. I need a new lamp.